Good morning and welcome to episode 12 of BuiltPlace's Housing Conversations. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Edwards, and today we're going to be talking about the housing crisis and why it's not so simple. Michael, good morning. And
Good morning.
in a report you wrote in 2015 for the future of cities, in your summary you suggested that the housing debate is bedeviled by rival simplifications. I would just wonder if you could explain what you meant by that.
Sure. In the last few years, we've seen all sorts of people expressing strong views about the housing situation. Some of them use the word crisis, some don't. But so many of these positions are really enormous oversimplifications. They are attributing all the problems we have to a single cause. I mean, we have people arguing a technical position that somehow it's all a problem of the productivity of the house building industry, and the solution to our housing problems is different kinds of building technology to speed up and improve productivity. A second approach is through a focus on financialization, saying that the housing problems we have are purely due to the penetration of financial relationships and financial institutions into the whole economy, including housing. And a subversion of that, a variant of the financialization argument, which is that the escalation of the prices of housing in Britain are down to very low interest rates. So that this is using a kind of asset pricing model to think about the housing stock. Another approach is to blame the whole thing on shortages of supply, to say that housing is essentially not that different from other commodities, that if the price is uncomfortably high, then there must be some problem about supply, and the need is to enormously expand supply. And that's the particular fetish which our present government is wedded to, and a lot of the think tanks which they rely on, and is really very dominant in the current discourse, both nationally and where I mostly work, which is in London planning. So all these things are offered as explanations of the problems and with their corresponding solutions. And I think they're all wrong, but also in a way they're all right. And it is a hell of a lot more intricate and complex than those approaches make it sound. I guess that's what I mean.
Okay. And so if they're all wrong and maybe partially right, what is right then? How would you describe the existing situation that we find ourselves in with respect to housing?
Well, I was trying to think, first of all, whether I could think of a single statement about the British housing situation, which I think is a valid summing up of the problem. And the nearest I could get was something like this: that if you distribute some commodity through a market exchange process, then people's capacity to get that commodity depends essentially on their income. I mean, that's the constraint on how much you can have, how much housing, how much whiskey, how much food, how much anything is constrained by your income. And two things have happened in Britain. One of relevance. One is that more and more and more of our housing is distributed now through market processes. The vast majority now is probably only 10% of our housing stock, which is outside of the market still. And that's a major change. 30 or 40 years ago, about half our housing stock was in the market and about half was outside the market in council housing and so on. So that's one big change. The other big change is that income and wealth has become much more unequal. And of course, if you have more and more access to housing being rationed by the market and radically growing inequality of spending power, then you're bound to get enormous inequalities in housing consumption and access to housing. I mean, that doesn't capture everything that's happened, but I mean, I would defend that as a single statement of the situation.
And I suppose that's where the rival simplifications would feed into that, because there is a danger for you that by trying to express it as one explanation for where we find ourselves, you kind of fall into the same trap that everyone else is. And whereas I suppose your explanation is more of a framework for why it's happening, and all these other factors feed into it. Would that be an appropriate way to look at it?
Yes, in a way. I think, to me, the most helpful way of thinking about it, and an approach which I think my students find helpful, is thinking of the various social forces, relationships which have a bearing on housing, operating at different geographic scales. I mean, some of them are global. There are some really worldwide processes going on about globalization of trade and finance, and the move towards ever lower interest rates in the financial markets. And these are things to be found, maybe not all of them everywhere, but very, very widely in the world. Some things are things which operate at a UK level, things like a lot of the taxation regime which affects housing, things like inheritance tax, capital gains tax, corporation tax, value-added tax. These are all things regulated by the UK national government, which have an enormous bearing on how people save, how they invest, how they organise their pensions. And all of that bears very heavily on housing, and that's a UK level process. Then there are things which are England specific, because we've got, in a way, the UK government acts as the English government for the purpose of housing and planning. So things about benefits, many things about benefits, planning regulations, planning policies are things which operate at that England level. And that's what we're all busy debating at the moment, because our extraordinary government has just come up with this white paper on how to change the planning system. And then there are very specific local things, because the whole housing issue is a land issue. I mean, it's an issue about land and land rights and land ownership. And these are things which have their particular configurations in particular localities. And the land ownership relationships which characterize the Highlands of Scotland, or the cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh, are very different. Different again from what happens in Manchester and Oldham and Rochdale, and different again from what happens in London. There are very particular regional historical forces which have conditioned these relationships. But in Britain generally, land ownership relations, I would say by international standards, still have a lot of feudal strands to them. They still have a lot of surviving remnants of pre-capitalist relationships, really. And some of that is still around causing us nightmares, like the whole breakdown of the leasehold system, which is really a medieval hangover and is what governs the owner occupation, so-called owner occupation of all British apartments, flats, and even some houses. And that market has pretty much ground to a halt because of many failings in this quite archaic kind of form of landed property. So that's a rather long, verbose answer. But I suppose what I'm saying is that to make sense of housing situations, you have to think about the interaction of these various forces which are acting at different geographic scales.
Yes. And
Okay.
you mentioned the white paper there, and
Yeah.
we've been talking about land, and there's clearly a lot of debate about the impact of the white paper. There's still a lot of detail we're not aware of yet. Quite a lot of detail.
Yeah.
But one there is an effort to try and increase the supply of land into the development process, and so is it a step in the right direction that the white paper suggests, or is it heading off in the wrong direction given the underlying issues that you've just been talking about in the land market and legalities and everything else?
Well, my view is that the white paper is based on a complete mistake. That the fundamental idea behind it is this idea that our housing problems are down to a lack of supply, that if we could increase the supply, we would resolve the affordability problems affecting housing. And the way to do that is to transform the planning system. Well, in my view, that's a mistake. Supply is not the overwhelming problem, not supply in the aggregate. We don't have a housing market which is a unified national market. It's a whole series of local markets which are very particular. And there's very strong evidence, and I'm particularly impressed by some of the recent work of Ian Mulhern, that far too much importance has been attributed to supply shortages in explaining the affordability problems that we have. But even if supply was the crucial thing, I think the planning system relaxing the planning system is not not a magical way to increase it, because land ownership is a set of social relationships which confer enormous power on landowners and landlords, property owners, at all scales where they own it. And we continue to get, if you like, local monopolies and local concentrations of power, and particularly in cities and city regions, which could make housing very unaffordable to a growing proportion of the population, even with far more land coming onto the market. So I think it's basically a distraction and a mistake. It's very hard indeed to think about the pros and cons, because we don't have enough detail. It doesn't offer us a way to get the social housing we need. I mean, we've been losing social housing ever since the 1980s by the right to buy and stock transfer. And we certainly need to reverse that and get a lot more social housing into the system. But this white paper is not offering us anything on that front. Indeed, it's probably making it worse, because the existing mechanisms, which are very unsatisfactory, of the Section 106 agreements, which, if you like, cross-subsidize some social housing out of the profits of private housing, that the government is proposing to scrap that and merge it with the community infrastructure levy in a new nationally determined levy, in which, by the look of it, any affordable housing would have to battle it out with local roads and parks and schools and other social infrastructure for a share of the money, and could very well end up with nothing. So from a social housing point of view, it's probably awful. And to me, that's the biggest single problem with it. The other problem with it is that it really takes away the local democracy, which has allowed people in local communities to really influence their local environments through decisions by local planning committees and so on. The white paper regards that as pure NIMBYism and really wants to abolish it. They want all the public participation and community activity concentrated at a plan making stage in the hope that it can then be cancelled at a planning permission stage. Well, I don't think that's practicable, but it's also very, very undemocratic, and I think it's going to be hugely resisted by people on the left and people on the right, including their own trusty supporters and voters in the shires. So I think it's an extraordinary piece of work, really. The only silver lining, there's one silver lining I can see in it, which is that the British planning system at the moment does have in it all this discretion. And the discretion is what allows local authorities to disregard their own policies by giving permission for things which infringe on some of their crucial policies because they want to achieve other policies. They can trade them off one against another. They can say, we're accepting a scheme with a very low social housing content because it offers us benefits in regeneration or in preservation of listed buildings or a new park or a new school. So from the point of view of community groups and local residents, you battle away to secure a good plan with good policies in it, and then you find your local politicians are giving it all away or selling it in order to achieve something else. And zoning systems are capable of preventing that. In many parts of the United States and mainland Europe, there are zoning systems which prevent that. So that could be a silver lining to this proposal, but we don't know because there are no details yet.
And you mentioned zoning in the US, and it has been touted by some organisations as being the solution to housing, and it's not an area that I have great expertise on it, but my understanding of zoning is that it brings as many risks as rewards, and particularly if you look at the impact it has in terms of discrimination in the US. Is that an area that you've done much looking at all in your experience of local campaigning?
I'm not an expert on North America at all or on US zoning, though I read books about it and stuff, but I have no first-hand or research experience of it. My reading of the literature is that there are enormous varieties of zoning systems in the United States and Canada, and a further variety across mainland Europe. And they can be used in different ways. Some historically in America have clearly been used as a way of reinforcing racial discrimination between black and white neighborhoods, income discrimination to keep poor people out of rich areas. But in other parts of the USA, zoning has been used to incentivize mixed price housing developments and make sure that there are low income housing in neighborhoods which are predominantly richer. So the devil is in the detail and how you design it and exactly what's permitted. What's also very crucial is who decides on the zoning definitions, whether they're decided nationally or locally. And part of the problem in the United States is that they're basically decided locally, I understand. So the New York City zoning ordinance is something, I'm told, something like 900 pages long and incredibly complicated and intricate. Well, that's not a simplification of the planning system, is it? It's just not. So we can't tell, I would say. We can't tell.
You mentioned earlier the kind of the regional and local differences, and you're heavily involved in London housing and policy around that in terms of campaigning. And we've seen Lichfield and others have published their view on what the standard method for calculating housing need is, and it suggests very, very large numbers for London, 94,000 I believe it is off the top of my head, which is way above anything that's been delivered in recent history. I was just wondering how you saw those numbers. First of all, the kind of the top-down central imposition of a number, and then what that might mean for London housing policy going forward.
Yeah. Well, the London housing and planning situation is a complete shambles and has been for quite a long time. I mean, here is London with its so far remarkably fast rate of growth of economy and population, which in fact has spilled out across the whole of the southeast of England and much of England. And there's a huge amount of commuting over long distances of people coming to work in London. So de facto, what's been happening is London's growth spilling out across large areas. But British planning is conducted under a sort of fantasy that each geographic area deals with its own problems, meets its own objectively assessed need. And for London, this has always been an impossible fantasy. In this latest round of the London Plan, the Mayor of London and the planning team struggled to find a way that they thought they could offer space in which 66,000 dwellings per year or 65,000 dwellings per year could be built. Paying a very high price for that in terms of space lost from other things. But a lot of that was going to be done through the intensification of the outer suburbs, a policy which the inspectors decided wasn't feasible and wasn't plausible and wouldn't happen, and so wanted it deleted from the plan. And the Secretary of State, when the Secretary of State gets the plan, he says, well, you're not proposing to build nearly enough housing. Your heroic efforts nowhere near what I shall require. So the whole thing is stalled at the moment, with the Secretary of State insisting on much higher housing output figures than the Mayor's been willing to offer, and those are already incredibly high compared with what's ever been possible. So it's a shambles. And now the Secretary of State has produced this new formula for working out what local areas are going to need to do, which is even more extreme in that it dumps far more, much higher requirement, as you say, something nearly 100,000 dwellings a year requirement for output on Greater London. It's kind of inconceivable where that could be put. And the social and environmental cost and energy cost of doing it are probably diabolical. In fact, the whole approach to this thing is incomprehensible, because so much of the growth in targets coming from the new algorithm, which Litchfields have analysed so nicely, is going into just the areas where Tory support is really strong and full of NIMBY middle-class people who are busy defending their local environment, and not just for NIMBY motives either. Some of them for strong environmental motives and landscape motives and so on, and would give us a scattered pattern of speculative building across the southern half of England, against enormous opposition, and probably environmentally extremely damaging, because it will all be car-based. Most of it is miles away from towns and cities. And so it does seem to me to be an example of extraordinarily bad thinking. Another bad algorithm, really, a bit like ones we've had before. Some bad algorithms.
Yes, I'm yet to see how they work out where the constraints then lead to the housing need being readjusted and redistributed across the south of England. And as you say, I suspect the local opposition is going to be substantial across all different political parties. And it's my personal view. It's unlikely that we'll actually see the end result coming anywhere near the current suggestions.
Yes, I think you're right. But I was just thinking, somebody today has produced a map showing, somebody called Michael Legg on Twitter this morning produced a very interesting map. I don't know who did it, maybe he did. But it's a map showing England, not Wales, with all the constraint areas that he could identify. So it's got a list, it's got green belts and AONBs and areas of scientific interest and so on. Some of them he's left out, but it really does leave areas, the remaining areas which would be unaffected by these constraints, which is where all this growth will have to go, are very much look awfully like Tory voting areas. So
we shall have to.
It remains to be seen, but it looks to me like another very bad bit of algorithm thinking. It's basically a political and strategic problem. They should be approaching this by saying, where are we going to put urban growth? Are we going to put it within urban areas or in the countryside? Bearing in mind that we've got to hugely reduce carbon emissions, and do that through reducing the need to travel, reducing the dependence on motor cars. So where are we going to put it all? But they don't seem to have done that at all. It's just, to me, incomprehensible.
Well, I think that there's an awful lot of people out there who are still trying to figure it out, and we're all awaiting more detail from government as it appears. But Michael, I've taken up more than enough of your time, and so thank you very much for joining and having this discussion with me today. It's always a delight to talk with you.
Okay, well, I found it very stimulating and interesting, and I shall go on watching your series with great interest and following the work, because I think this very careful analytical work that you do on localities is enormously valuable, because that's where these things can be understood in the actual nitty-gritty of our extraordinary system. So thank you.
No, thank you.